Hiya, and welcome to Minor Productions. So rather than do the usual just ramblings on in my mind, do my field work, I thought we'd maybe put together, or try and put together, some proper production with a bit of proper history about the different collieries in and around East Lancashire, particularly around the Rossendale area, although I'm going to encroach a little bit onto Burnley, Accrington and Rochdale, but make no apologies for this. Basically, I've been studying the local mines since I was about 15, and I got a lot of help off the man who laid the groundwork for most of this study, which was Big John Davis. Actually, John was really called Jack, but that's beside the point. And John took me under his wing as a 15-year-old, asking him many annoying questions that there were obvious answers to, and he never lost any patience. Now sadly we lost John in 1997, but his legacy in all the hard work he did lives on. He painstakingly went through all the old papers, went through maps, interviewed old colliers, and along with his friend Steenie Spencer, they walked the length and breadth of the Rossendale moors looking for old mines, getting themselves in where they could and carefully cataloguing them. Now if John had been alive today, he'd have had a field day really, with all the modern technology we have where we can kind of, well, from the comfort of our own homes, we can look at the newspaper archives, we can go down to the coal authority and request plans. The list of places where we can get research results is unlimited, and I'm sure John would have put together a far better history than I could, but I'm just trying to build on the legacy that John left. Today we're going to look at Walla Nook Colliery, or as it looks like on the map, Wholaw Nook, but it's Walla, that's what I know the pronunciation of. And where we are present, we're stood on Townley land in front of the farm that's known as Walla, or in old language it was Harlow. Now this land that we're stood on, behind me towards the right hand side is Cloudbridge Reservoir, Crown Point Road is straight in front of me. This is Habergham Eves, and in 1518 John Townley took it upon himself to enclose this what was waste land, because he said that he had a deed, and that deed entitled him to keep a leash of greyhounds. What's a leash of greyhounds? Is that something a bit like a murder of crows? Anyway, the eminent historian Dr. Whitaker from Cliviture, well, he had this to say about the common people. Now I hate to use that word common people because we're all the same, aren't we? But he said, right, that the superstition of the common people have deemed that John Townley's spirit will wander restlessly and with no rest at all along these waste grounds, endlessly crying out, lay out, Harlow and Holling Hayclough. Lay out means to open up. In 1526, Richard Townley got a deed to work the Broadhead Colliery. Seem to have a lot of deeds, these Townleys, don't they? So where was Broadhead Colliery? Well, we don't know exactly for sure, but we have a good idea, because the crop edge of the famous Harlow mine runs from Habergham Clough all the way across the hill to Sepp Clough, which is the top of Rossendale Road these days, and across onto Healy Heights. And LiDAR, again modern technology, shows lots of old shafts in that field. Some have been proved to be around about 9 yards deep, so we think that that is where the Broadhead Colliery was. Now the problem with Richard opening this up was that the tenants of the land already had rights to dig their own coal, and up pops Richard and stops them because he wants a commercial mine. So this got the anger of the local people, not only the local common people, but also Hugh Habergham and two of the Shuttleworths, who were men quite a little bit of clout at the time, and they gathered together between 80 or 90 people out of Burnley, and they came and basically they trashed the pit, they smashed it up, all the machinery on the surface, whatever there was, the gins, the pumps, whatever there was, and underground they smashed things up as well, and they made it so that Richard couldn't get back in. It was totally destroyed. In fact, one witness said, if you're going to deprive us of the coal, you'll have to deprive us at the edge of a sword. So that was the end of that particular project. So why am I talking about that? Because we're now at Harlow, which is a very big farm on Townley's land. We're looking down towards the Cloudbridge. This used to be known as Hapton. Many people wonder why Cloudbridge Reservoir was known as Hapton Reservoir, and that's because for many years was part and parcel of the township of Hapton. Well, we have an old court roll that dates from 1596 that helps outline part of the boundary. This is pertaining really to the boundary between Hapton and Henheads. And Henheads, if you don't know, was on the other side of Goodshire Hill. It was on the Accrington border. But this survey was undertaken in 1596, and it was where are we? Yeah, it lays out the border between Hapton and Henheads. It says, from the Mere Head Well, lineally to a great stone having 3 crosses upon, placed about 5 rods, and there were 7 rods to the yard, southward from the way under Hamilton. Now then, the way under Hamilton layeth betwixt Nutcher Gate and High Riley. And then the other part of the boundary was from the stone, in a linear direction, to the weir or floodgate in the head of the hedge of the fence in the Great Clough Head. Now I'm taking the Great Clough Head to actually be Great Clough or Hapton Clough, and we're going to have a look up there later. So this area has big connections with being part of Hapton. In fact, in the mid 1850s, one of the Padiham councillors wanted to make it part of Padiham. Why? Well, because of the vast mineral wealth that lay under the hills that was later taken by Hapton Valley Colliery and Burnt Hills Colliery. So we'll leave the ruins of Harlow now. Harlow Farm, if you want to come and get access to it, it's best skidding it from the Crown Point Road, but it's quite a substantial ruin, and it's a beautiful view across the Limey Valley from here. In fact, the Limey water we can see down in the clough down here as its origins. Now Harlow, or Walla, is very significant also because underneath where we stand is the limits to Townley Colliery. In fact, it comes very close to the crop edge, and by looking at Dickinson's old map, it looks as though they did want to drive drifts in from this side of the hill originally for the Townley coal. And also shown on the plan, right directly beneath us in the lower mountain mine working, is a big excavated area. Now it looks like a short long wall face, but I don't think it is. But basically, under Walla, there's a great big hollow. I'm in the field where, according to Dickinson's map, he says the horse pasture coal or the 2-foot coal crops out. And I've had a good walk up and down the field. There's a fault off towards me right hand side, towards Walla, and the crop edge is supposed to come across this field. There's not many obvious signs. There's plenty of signs of moisture coming into the field, but the most obvious place that it looks like where they could possibly have been in for a nibble is where my rucksack is. That's at the head of a little ditch. And certainly if they knew the crop edge was here, they're going to have been in to explore, to try it, or just getting some crop edge coal for the farm. So this is where the horse pasture coal, we think, crops out. And we're about 150, 200 yards away from Walla itself. There's another view of it. Crown Point Road is in the background on the crest of the hill. Walla Farm itself is just over there. You can just see a sheep near it. No real obvious signs of anywhere else along the field. Bits of different coloured grass, which is generally a telltale sign. So we'll take this as perhaps where the 2-foot horse pasture crop. I've got a LiDAR image of Walla Farm. You can see the very extensive remains. Amazing what LiDAR shows up. And there's a fault that runs from the bottom of the field up. And the outcrop I was looking for a start is along this field, and we can just see there near the hand that appears to be the way in that I found an old drift at, what's possibly an old drift, and if you look at the LiDAR it certainly is. Another outcrop runs from the farm down across here above the Limey water, and also this area here Dickinson shows as old crop workings, although I didn't really discern any of them at the time. Interesting, Dickinson calls them old crop workings, which means they were very old by the year 1860. So that's the area of the crop workings, and there's a fault runs across here, a big fault, and we've got the Walla Nook workings. And LiDAR shows us clearly where the shaft was. There's a mound behind it, which was possibly the shaft. And that interesting there, was that perhaps a cart track back to the road? I don't know, I'm not saying it was. But LiDAR brings up lots of things. And obviously all the little pimples there are trees. Yeah, you've probably heard me mention Joseph Dickinson a few times. So who was he? Well, Joseph Dickinson was the first mines inspector for the Manchester district, and Rossendale came under the Manchester district. Now, I'm really fascinated by different people who are involved in the mining industry and how they connect up and intertwine. Because Joseph Dickinson, his father, was the moor master up on Alston Moor and was in charge of running all the Alston Moor mines. Oh, what a fantastic connection. So Joseph Dickinson became mines inspector for the Manchester district around about 1850, 1851 when it became legal. And what Joseph did, he was a very, very clever man. Well, it must have been to get the job, mustn't he? And he was also a member of the North of England, or the Manchester branch of the North of England mining engineers and mechanics. And what Joseph did, he had the First Ordnance Survey map, or any old map he could find, usually the First Ordnance Survey, and he would mark the different collieries on his map as he visited them. And if there was any accidents that he got called to, well, he would usually try and mark the point of that accident, where it occurred underground and what caused it on the plan. So it's invaluable. Sadly, it can be quite hard to read because he's tried to cram all this information into one little place. But we can glean something off it. But another tragedy is that the sheets pertaining to central Rossendale through Crawshire Booth, Water, up towards Bacup and Shiny Ford, somebody's pinched them. We haven't got them. But what we have got for the Rossendale Valley encompasses just this part of the sheet, round about Gambleside, up onto Hamilton Hill and Cupola, and then we've got all of Rewley Moor Road down into Whitworth and Rochdale and over across the Wardle. So we have some things. So where I'm stood at present, we're nearly at the head of the Limey Water, and this little valley connects with another valley that comes down from behind Walla Farm. And according to Joseph Dickinson, what he marks on the plan is all the extensive boring operations that they did around about the 1820s. Boring operations in 1821? Clive, aren't you still boring us in 2021? But that aside, around about 1826, we think it was Townley, was doing extensive research on these fells, these hills, where all the coal was. And also on Dickinson's map, he puts that there's a proposed drift going to go into what eventually became the Townley colliery workings in this clough. Now, it doesn't look like it ever went ahead, but it looks to be marked on his map as proposed level mouth. So who was working the coal back then? Well, as far as we know, the workings then that were being carried on were being carried on in Dunwickshire itself, at Burnt Hills Colliery. Burnt Hills Colliery itself appears on Hennett's map of Burnley, 1829. And at the time it was being worked by the Hargreaves. Now, anybody that knows anything about East Lancashire mining has heard of Hargreaves collieries, haven't they? Yeah, but there was two different Hargreaves. There was the Hargreaves of Rossendale and Accrington, and there was the Hargreaves of Burnley. And interestingly enough, they both came from Rossendale. John Hargreaves came from Goodshire Fold. He became Colonel John Hargreaves because he was the head of a local militia. But he married a widow from Burnley, the widow of the Reverend Thursby, and through that marriage he inherited an awful lot of the Burnley mines, and he set up a company, John Hargreaves & Co, that became known as, after he died of course, the Exes of John Hargreaves. And if you happen to be in Goodshire Fold, well, the biggest tourist attraction there is the Spewing Duck, and if you read, it is donated by the Exors of John Hargreaves. So we certainly know then that Burnt Hills Colliery was operating from 1829. But why is that relevant when we're talking about Walla Nook? That's because they were in the same coal. Burnt Hills worked to the rise, and after Hargreaves had finished working it around about the 1850s, I don't know if a lease ended then, but certainly big changes were made. Townley again, through Brooks and Pickup, started working this patch of coal as Walla Nook Colliery. So let's now go and have a look down and see if we can find the remains of Walla Nook pit. Well, sadly we've got a barking dog that's seen Morgan. Well, we're just off Limers Gate, the junction of Limers Gate and what used to be the Edenfield Burnley Turnpike, and there we can see Walla Nook Colliery heaped there. We've come from where those trees are, where's the head of the Limey Water, and Walla or Hollow beyond it. As you look under those fields there, the Townley Colliery workings and Hapton Valley Colliery workings are underneath it, and obviously Walla Nook, nestling quietly in the valley bottom. Well, again, I'm stood on Limer's Lane, Limer's Gate from the old Norse word meaning road, and you can see a heap of Walla Nook Colliery and some of the engine beds in the background. I thought it'd be good just to discuss a little bit the history of the coal mining within Rossendale. Obviously we don't know when it first started, that's impossible. We do have court rolls back to this area from 1612. But an old document has just turned up, a court roll from the manor of Clitheroe, that was looking into what mines might be worthwhile working round about the manor of Accrington. And well, we're not in Accrington, but back then we weren't far off, and what was found in that report certainly pertains to where we are at present. Back in 1584, Sir Richard Sharborn, Knight of the Realm, and Randall Hudson were commissioned, no it was not, Hurlston, were commissioned to report on any coal, canal and other diverse things that may be mined that Queen Elizabeth may be able to gain monetary benefit from. So they quickly dispatched Thomas Fleetwood and Hugh Jones off to Accrington to see what might be going on in the murky forests, because obviously people were mining but they weren't paying for it. Now then, Mr. Fleetwood and Mr. Jones certainly found out that people were working coal and cannel and also lead ore in the manor of Accrington. So by mentioning lead ore, we know that obviously they were talking around this area, because the Thieveley lead vein, the lead mine fault, runs across the hill from Hameldon, right past Cloudbridge Reservoir, up onto Whitehill and off towards Thieveley, and they were at lead. You mean there was a lead mine in Lancashire, in Dunnockshire even? Yes, there was. In the 1750s, the offices for the, what were they called, the Dunnockshire Mine Adventurers Company, was situated in Dunnockshire. And they had a smelt mill built in Great Clough above Bluff Clough. So it wasn't very successful, but nevertheless it was here. Now then, going back to that court roll from the 1500s, they said that there was coal and cannel and lead, and they recommended that a yearly rent of 5 shillings should be paid to Her Majesty for the privilege of working the mines. So we know they knew the coal was here, and we know that people were working it at that time, obviously on a very small scale. You might ask though, what's cannel? Well, cannel, it's a bit like coal, it's hard, bituminous, but most of the carbon matter has gone, so it's bordering on between coal and oil shale. Now they mined it, it was very valuable around the Wigan area, very, very hard. There's not a lot of cannel around here, but it exists, and it's above the Upper Mountain mine, and it's near the Horse Pasture coal seam as well that we've just been looking at up towards Walla or Harlow. And the cannel was mined very briefly and for just a short while at Townley, and also up towards Deerplay at Black Clough. And we know that there's cannel situated in this village also. Now, matter of point, the ancients used to use cannel to make jewellery out of, and we know that this area has been populated for a long time, and I haven't found them, I wish I could. They've found flint axes, so maybe they even got into the cannel as well to carve jewellery. Who knows? Well, behind me now is Cloudbridge Reservoir. I'm on the other side of the lane. Cloudbridge Res was made in 1866. It covers 79 acres and it's 31 feet deep, and its capacity is round about 323 million gallons. Right, that's the boring statistics of it. My old school teacher, actually, she used to learn all her yachting on there. Yeah, she was a highly trained yachtswoman, a champion actually. Doesn't that go to show that I went to such a good school? And you've probably guessed by now, I am an old Fearnsonian. Yeah, don't get carried away, it weren't that good. The school dinners were terrible. Do you know what? They used to serve red wine with a fish course. As I said before, it was the Hargreaves that started mining on a proper scale, as we know of anyway, you know. It probably carried out long before that. They started off at the Burnt Hills Colliery, or Nutshire. You see that old quarry up there? That used to be red when I was a kid, and that's why the name Burnt Hills came to be, because it looked like the hills had actually been burnt. So they worked the colliery up there from certainly 1829 up until the early 1850s. And actually it's only one of two pits in the Rossendale area. You'll say this is Burnley. Yeah, well, We'll give you that. I think of it as part of Rossendale coalfield. But anyway, it's only one of 2 pits in this area that was on the 1841 mines report where they looked into child labour. So we have an idea how many was working there. But around about 1850, our greasers were leasing it off Townley. Either the lease came to an end or they moved on to better things. I would say that the lease came to an end, and they developed further up the hill at Porter's Gate, and also by the side of Cotton Row they sunk a deep shaft 340 odd feet down to the lower mountain mine. And then they put a miniature railway, or a tramway, a ginny as we call them, all across the hill right down to Hapton Valley Colliery. But that's for another day. We'll talk about that when we go into the Burnt Hills. We're going to go across to Walla Nook pit itself, but on our way there we're going to have a look and see if we can find an old shaft that nobody knows anything about, apart from the fact that Dickinson mentions it and says that it's 6 yards down to the upper mountain or top bed coal. Here's a shaft at Walla Nook Colliery. The shaft is about 32 yards deep to the lower mountain mine, and it looks as though we've had a beam engine on top. There was more than one shaft, there was 2 shafts associated with it. Now the actual opening date, I can't be very precise. Dickinson has it marked on his map as 1867. Hey little one, but it could be before. I can't remember off the inspector's reports. It didn't work very long. By the mid 1870s, late 1870s, it was discontinued, and then it was later abandoned. Looking down on the site, we count 1, 2, 3, 4 engine beds, or certainly what looked like 4 engine beds. We think that it had a beam pump. That's certainly been a big engine on top of there, for possibly for winding. Has this here been one of the other shafts? I do have a plan of the mine. I say it worked the lower mountain around about 3 foot, and then the phenomena of the union across the field of take. Now the line of union, sometimes known as the Aitken line, is where the lower mountain mine is joined by the upper foot mine. The upper foot comes down to meet the lower mountain and makes one seam of between 4'6" and 5 feet. The union coal, however, wasn't quite as good quality, even though 2 seams came together. And according to all the old colliers, believe it or not, it was harder to hew. It took you a lot longer to fill 15, 17 or 18 in the union mine than it would in the lower mountain. Seems crazy, doesn't it? It's like the union coal makes it more fibrous. I've had a bit of a go at getting it up at hilltop, and you just like you're drilling holes in it, making it like a lump of cheese. Yeah, like a lump of cheddar. So this is basically, we don't know a lot about the working, day-to-day working of Walla Nook Colliery. There are papers in the archive, we believe, that might tell us a little bit more, if I can get to the archive with everything that's going on. We know that in 1868 the banksman was Henry Ashworth, and he lived on Cotton Row. I pointed out, didn't I, earlier on, where Burnt Hills Colliery was, side of Cotton Row, the new Burnt Hills, the deep shaft. Well, he lived on there, and his wife helped lay a body out of somebody that got killed in Burnt Hills that date. That's how we know he lived there. Apart from that, we know very little. We do know about the people that owned it and the manager, and I've talked about Townley Colliery quite a bit. You might think, well, what's Townley Colliery got to do with Walla Nook? Well, because they were run by Brooks and Pickup. Brooks and Pickup basically was Lord Crawshaw, or Brooks, and Peter Pickup. Now, we know Lord Crawshaw was from Crawshaw Booth, owned Sunnyside Printworks. Tried to run for Parliament. I can't remember if he was successful, he probably was. Then he became a peer of the realm, High Sheriff of Lancashire. Peter Pickup, on the other hand, was off a farm. Now, back in those days, farmers were quite prosperous compared to just normal people, if you will. And Peter had a father called Peter, who had another father called Peter. But the Peter we were interested in, born in the 1820s, just off New Lathe Farm. Well, we think he was born in Bridgeley Bank, that's where he lived later on. Now, Peter Pickup went into business sometime in the 1850s with Mr. Brooks, Lord Crawshaw. Obviously Peter Pickup had all the mining knowledge and Mr. Brooks had all the money. And they teamed up also with with the Townleys and leased most of the coal off their land. First of all, they were up at Walla Colliery up on Hambledon Hill, and then they went in and started the Townley collieries with Boggart Brig in about 1860, and then Townley Colliery itself. And we think obviously they came here sometime in the 1860s as well. Now the manager here for a long time was a man called Jonathan Hudson. Now not many people know about the Hudsons, but the Hudsons and the Pickups were inseparable. In fact, Peter Pickup had married Esther Hudson, and Esther Hudson was auntie to the manager here, you see. The Hudsons stayed involved with Brooks and Pickup for a long time until Richard Hudson, who was the manager, went and worked for Hargreaves. But that's a different story. We'll talk about that another time as we talk about Walla Colliery, and then another time we'll talk about Baxenden and get really stuck into the Hudsons, because they really were a very interesting and fascinating family. And it's that sometimes that brings the pits to life, because I know I said without people a pit is just a hole in the ground. That's not technically true. It's more than that, because each pit has its own atmosphere. I know when we were young ones, about 14, 15, 16, we were up on Rulimore Road and we were searching around some old pits up there. We were in Bramwood, and then we went in Hallcombe. And a young lad that was with us, our age, Russ Howard, he said, when we were going in Hallcombe, he said, what a friendly atmosphere the pit had. And it was funny he should say that, because I picked up on that as well. And each pit does have its own atmosphere. But a word to the Coal Authority: before you start dieseling up that cement mixer, those pits are long still, they've gone. They're well and truly filled in. Just before we finish today, it might just be interesting just to whet your appetite a little bit about the Hudson family and who they were. Well, they lived up on New Lathe Farm, that's where they were from. And Jonathan's great grandfather just happened to be in Preston in the year 1745, the time of the Jacobite rebellion. And the story goes that a Highlander relieved him of his shoes because they were better than his. Well, what are you supposed to do when there's a Highlander with a claymore at your throat? Tell him to clear off to Winfields and get his own. As we come down through the generations, all of the family, well, most of the family, seem to have been involved in the Walla Colliery. And young Jonathan, who was the son of Reuben, well, he was brought up on Dole's farm. Dole's farm is down behind the print works, down Commercial Street on the hillside at the back of there. Sadly, his father died very young. But young Jonathan, like his brother, were employed up at Walla Colliery. His brother became an engineer, but when they say engineer, that usually means that they were driving the haulage, perhaps in charge of the surface engine. But that's another story up at Walla, the surface engine. But young Jonathan at one time was down as a blacksmith, so obviously he was learning every trade that there was to do with the pits. And by 1861 he was living in Underwood Terrace, which is near Loughclough Park, because his father had died. And living with him was his grandma and his uncle. Now his Uncle George, he's interesting as well. The whole family were musical, and George is down as a pianist. Later on he was a professor of music. Now young Jonathan went through all the ranks at the pit and got all his qualifications. He became under manager at Walla, and then he became manager over Walla Colliery and Walla Nook Colliery here. Sadly, we don't know much more about him after that. I don't think he lived very long. Either that, or we've lost track of him on the censuses. But say, we'll go into the Hudsons later on, because they're a fascinating family. Well, I'd like to thank you for bearing with me. I hope it's been interesting for you, and I will try and get different with the production techniques and stop shaking so much with the camera. So, hope to see you next time.